Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical.
Episode 3, Why Utopian Experiments Matter.
I'm Trisha Yeager.
And I'm Eleanor Rust.
This is a podcast about Frances Wright, reformer, philosopher, writer, activist, abolitionist before it was cool, feminist long before the word existed.
The story so far. Frances Wright, known to her friends as Fanny, left behind the constraints of her privileged upbringing in the UK. Think ladies in Jane Austen or Bridgerton, and you won't be far off. So she can travel and write about politics and philosophy.
This brought her into the company of thinkers, writers, celebrities, and revolutionaries. She became so close with the Marquis de Lafayette that he considered adopting her. In fact, when Lafayette made a grand tour of the U.S. around the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Fanny Wright and her sister Camilla joined him.
She saw more of the best and the worst of the United States on that trip, and she met and spoke with past presidents, revolutionary heroes, and slaveholders, and people like Thomas Jefferson, who were all three. She was already firmly on the side of liberty, and what she saw and heard disturbed her and got her thinking. She called slavery a plague spot that soils the beauty of American liberty.
So what solution did she turn to remove this plague spot? Utopia, of course, obviously.
Okay, Trista, what do you mean by utopia, and what is a utopian community?
I'm going to try to keep this brief, but what I'm talking about here is not a sci-fi vision of the future, nor, evil counterpart. So not utopia and dystopia in the way it's often used right now. But at the time, it was seen as a way to build a better society by starting small and sort of proving a model that might apply to society at large. So you'd start with just a group of people living in community who agree to share labor or the products of their labor and often share all their property beyond, a few personal items. As you can tell, we're talking about people who are following a set of principles and procedures that aren't shared by the outside world. So don't think about like an HOA or something along those lines. Think more of what you might think of when you think of a commune, but perhaps a little more staid in certain respects. So people who study these communities prefer terms like intentional community, or as I mentioned, living in community when they're talking about these groups of people.
And intentional communities are a lot more common than you might think now, and maybe especially in Fanny's time. Hippie communes in the 1970s and cults of any era dominate headlines, Netflix documentaries and podcasts. But really, there are less sensational and more idealistic communal living organizations. They're probably the majority over time, actually.
Yeah. So in this episode, we're going to dig into the utopian communities Fanny got involved in. And we're going to talk about why she then decided to found her own, Nashoba, near Memphis, Tennessee.
So on that grand tour of the U.S. with Lafayette, Frances learned about two utopian communities that had one place in common, and she had to see them for herself.
We heard a little about these places, or this place, from Cheryl Coulthard in episode 1, but it doesn't hurt to recap, of course. New Harmony, put that square on your bingo card. It's here. So one community, the Harmony Society, was led by the Rapp family, and they built a thriving, well-organized town from almost nothing on the Wabash River in southern Indiana, which at the time was basically the Wild West. They were deeply religious. When Fanny visited, the Rappites had decided to move on to a new place and to sell the whole town of Harmony to an Englishman with a dream. That's Robert Owen, a famous factory owner and reformer who would create New Harmony there with a plucky band of anti-religious misfits and geniuses. So when you think of Owen, think of a combo of Bill Gates and Elon Musk, but a lot kinder and really actually hoping to help humanity.
Okay, so to go deeper into these communities and what they meant for Frances, we talked to an expert. Sylvia Rhoda is a professor at the University of Southern Indiana, where she directs the Center for Communal Studies. She'll tell us more about both Harmony and New Harmony.
All right, first off, why don't we talk for a second about the Harmonists and the Owenites? Who are they, and why did they establish communities?
Yes, the Harmonists and Owenites formed intentional communities in Pennsylvania and in Indiana. They came from Europe in the late 18th century and arrived in the United States in the 19th century. They, of course, were disappointed or disillusioned with what was happening in Europe. And just to put a quote out from Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, before you can build a utopia or a heaven on earth, you have to go through hell. And this is paraphrased, of course. And I think that the Harmonists, as well as the Owenites, they lived their little hell in, or what they perceived as their hell. So the Harmonists, first of all, they rebelled. They were radical pietists from the Duchy of Württemberg who went against the institutionalized church. They also went against military service. They didn't want to pay taxes. So they were a rebel of sorts. And they saw their newfound freedom, or a place where they could exercise their freedom, in the United States. And remember, too, through communication, the Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment, and so on, that Europe was much more aware of what was going on in the United States, where a constitution already was established. So that there was this ideal place with a lot of land that they could access and pursue, avoid the draft, practice their own religious services, and live the way they wanted to.
How did they want to live?
They wanted what I call live in a trispherical kind of realm. They wanted to practice it in a socialist community, but they also wanted to be venture capitalists with the outside world. And all of that was cloaked in some kind of a millennial spiritual sphere where they awaited the second coming of Christ.
I was going to say those two concepts, the sort of the millennialist or apocalyptic, maybe is too harsh a word, but and the venture capital side. So how did they harmonize? How did the Harmonists harmonize those two concepts?
I think one of the successes, if you want to call it that, was to isolate the community. So Rupp, the leader of the founder and leader of the movement, he created a society with 800 people. Now that he put in an isolated area of the United States, especially in Indiana here, and where he had strict control. For example, he didn't allow the group to learn the English language, except for a few exceptional leaders who dealt in venture capital endeavors with the outside world. So there was a strict control, but they were very clever, very entrepreneurial in their economic and capitalist pursuits. Yeah, they were very wealthy, a very wealthy community. So again, isolating the group within, but also exploring through a few members riches with the outside, but keeping the strict spiritual realm intact by hoping for the second coming of Christ.
And that contrasts pretty distinctly with Robert Owen and his followers. Can you tell me a bit about their approach to community?
But again, you have to look at Europe. You had a very strict social system, a social hierarchy, where creating any kind of social equality was very tricky, was impossible, I would argue. And Owen, coming from a rich industrialist background, who wanted to share more of the wealth and create equality with his workers and colleagues, he understood that he would have to leave Europe to pursue his dream or his utopian visions. And that was, I think, a major reason for him to come to the United States. Now, when the Owenites were in the United States, they also isolated themselves. They bought the community after the Harmonists left from George Rupp in Indiana and settled in what you would call a materially fixed intentional community. Yeah? And they pursued their dream of equality, emancipation, freedom of speech, intellectual endeavors. So yes, they were where the Harmonists were intellectually stifled. It was the opposite for the Owenites.
All right, that's really fascinating. So, we've got these two very distinct, different communities that are sort of have some similar or related goals, and yet they went about them in very different ways. So, why do people do this? Why do people go to some remote place, isolate themselves, and then try to create these intentional communities instead of, I don't know, making change in their own village or whatever the other alternatives might be? What is your research discovered?
Again, I would think with the Industrial Revolution and the opportunity for movability, that was a big contributor to bridge continents, to try to pursue the dream on a different continent. But also, I think with the end of the religious wars, with the end of the French Revolution, there were these opportunities, or they saw opportunities of really turning a utopian vision into a practical dream. So they went from theory basically to practical application. And that, of course, was fascinating to see that happening, that it was not only a dream anymore, but a possibility to pursue the dream.
That's such a great point, the sort of disruptions and social disorder of industrialism, and then I guess things like the French Revolutions and all the reverberations of that huge upheaval kind of knocked people loose and let them say like, hey, we could actually try some of this stuff in the flesh.
Right. But you also have to realize that these people who pursued the dream in the United States, an utopian community or an intentional community that became, they also did not come from a poor background.
Mm-hmm.
They were wealthy. You needed to have the startup capital in order to do something like that. And you had to recognize what I call the negative status quo, the limitations in your own surroundings to pursue the other.
Interesting. So a lot of these communities didn't do as well as the harmonists, right? You mentioned that the harmonists were very wealthy, and there's a lot of historical records that they, had, I don't know, I think it was like 5 times the per capita revenue compared to the frontier communities around them. So pretty huge, notable difference in wealth. But still, a lot of these communities didn't do as well. And Owen's community is a great example of that. What tended to go wrong?
Okay, I think what I call these traditional isolationist utopias that went out into the blue yonder to establish a new community, their main success was based on isolation. So the longer they isolated themselves, the longer the community survived. And it also, all of them were marked by strong leadership. I would say an autocratic leadership, which the Owenites really didn't have. They started out as an egalitarian community. So it was very hard when you have so many ideas coming together and attempts of improving the community or adding to the community, of course, the evolutionary process is very fast, becomes very fast.
Mm-hmm.
The isolationist communities usually try to stop an evolutionary process from within. So I think the more they developed, the faster they failed.
So there's a lot of different approaches to these, whether they're isolated or intentional or heteroutopic. Oh my gosh,
yes,
what a word!
Yes.
Why are they worth studying? Why do we need to think about the Owenites or the harmonists like that? I mean, it's obviously historically really cool, and if anyone who's ever been to New Harmony, it has this wonderful kind of resonant charm that remains. But why does it matter?
I honestly think it becomes even more crucial in the 21st century to learn from these communities, because when you look at housing in a larger context right now, most people can't afford their homes anymore. We are leaving a tremendously large footprint on this earth. Studies have shown that we are much more lonely than ever. So how can we overcome this kind of habitation as humans? What can we do in order to create more ideal societies again, communities that help us to deal with all of this disenfranchisement, emotionally, materially, environmentally? And if we study these communities and see what worked and what didn't work, perhaps we can we can improve, we can build on, can come up with something new.
So a lot of people like to point to the failure aspect, which is, I know that's a word that in communal studies is not as popular as it once was, and analyzing things as successes or failures based on, say, their longevity or other things. That New Harmony specifically is often kind of labeled a failure, but then many, many exciting people like Frances Wright, Robert Dale Owen, Josiah Warren came out and did all sorts of really interesting things in the world. So I'm wondering if you can help us understand a better way to evaluate these communities, if we're going to use them as potential sources to understand how humans can work together or live together more beneficially. How do we, what's our rubric?
I look at New Harmony, as you mentioned, as a laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what kind, it's not the end goal, but it's what type of experiments did they engage in that we can pick upon and select. So I think in utopian or intentional communities, it's not the end goal. It's not what happened to those communities as I see it, but what was done while they were active. It's that active period that I'm looking at. What came out of that? And like you said, there were these powerful individuals who contributed to American society, I think to the world, if you want to be, if you want to look even further. And also looking at New Harmony, for example, I think there was still all over the decades and centuries, there was more happening is happening in New Harmony. I just want to point out Jane Owen, who resided in New Harmony for a long time and helped to develop or to create new architectural landmarks. And it's that experiment, that laboratory that counts.
I love it. And that makes me think of Frances Wright in particular and having the experience of a much freer gender regime, for lack of a better way to say it, and the sort of openness there. For example, that women could choose their dance partners and dancing was a big deal.
Right.
And that you could go up to a guy and just be like, we're going to do the waltz. And the guy would be like, okay, which would have been unheard of in other places. I think those tiny moments, it's hard for us now to appreciate how meaningful those might have been to someone like Frances or to Robert Dale Owen, and how that could have opened up new avenues for men and women to talk in radically new ways, right? That weren't either courtship related or, you're my brother, or, there was maybe some new room for new kinds of relationships.
Yes, definitely. And you have to have those models. How can you go through history without being able to look at something, model after something, reject the model perhaps? And in where we are right now in history, it's even more crucial to look at perhaps Fanny Wright, to look at a Gertrude Rupp, to see what did they bring to society? How did they change society for the sake of women, for example?
Amazing. Well, is there anything else you want to tell us about, say, some of the? I know you are part of a center that's dedicated to the study of this kind of communities. Can you tell us a little bit about your mission and what kind of resources you have? If people have more questions about communal societies, where would you recommend they start? Because I know there are lots of sort of popular cultural references to things like cults and utopias and such, but how can someone go a little deeper and get at the history and theory of some of these places?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to invite everybody to come to the University of Southern Indiana at the Center for Communal Studies, because we are, as far as I know, the only university that actually houses an archive on intentional communities. And we have about 15,000 images, 500 communities, the primary sources, and 340 oral histories on intentional communities. So if you're, whatever your heart desires, it's probably there, or some of it. And
amazing.
Yes. So this is all housed in the Rice Library, but it's also digitalized, most of it, which is helpful if you want to access it from abroad. So the center, is a starting point, definitely. But what I also would like to include in all of this is we also have a Minka Center, which is a kind of a small house community project that we do with gerontology. And we house some interesting workshops or offer some interesting workshops and so on, where we combine, again, practical application of how can you live with the theoretical, the paper and documentation that we have on the other side to read about options. And I think that's very precious.
I love that New Harmony has still, like, in some ways, this is also an echo of New Harmony, because I don't think this center would exist at USI if it weren't for, some crazy millenarian, the world is ending peasants from Württemberg who wound up on the Wabash. And then we're followed by the charismatic, but sometimes a little bit out of control Robert Owen. I love it. This is so cool that in some ways you're keeping the spirit of New Harmony alive.
Yes, and we want to introduce it to our students here, because it's something so unique and so special for them to look at and analyze history and what we can do to improve future living as a community, as a humanity.
I love it. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on the program.
As Sylvia mentioned, New Harmony as a formal intentional community didn't last that long, but it had serious impact. And Trista, you're a little obsessed with New Harmony. I want to hear what you think was most important in the impact of New Harmony.
I admit I have a problem. So New Harmony is a really interesting instance in that it's easy to condemn it as a failed experiment, but it's hard to ignore its impact on America. So Robert Owen's connections and fame made the New Harmony experiment famous. Owen brought together this amazing group of scientists and thinkers and educators. I mean, when we say brought together, he literally put them on a keelboat and floated them down the Ohio with like ridiculous amounts of books and equipment and all sorts of things, which was jokingly called the boatload of knowledge, but that name is stuck. So if you might hear that term thrown around a lot when you hear about New Harmony. So these big brainiacs may not have helped the community feed itself or become self-sufficient, but they did make important scientific discoveries and pioneering changes, especially in early childhood education. Many stuck around New Harmony and kept working, and their impact is honestly still palpable today in the town. One other really interesting thing that happened in New Harmony was printing. Newspapers especially were written and published by the Owens, and later Fanny joined them in that endeavor. But part of New Harmony's impact was what the experiment said about what not to do when founding a community. Fanny noticed these things, saw what didn't work well, and saw that it maybe isn't the best idea just to collect some really cool big brains in the middle of nowhere and hope things work out.
And Fanny herself may have written that the history of New Harmony was much vexed and much distorted. In an age like the present, it is little astonishing that 1,000 romances should be connected with it, which never had existence.
That wonderful phrase is from a contemporary book about Fanny that claims to be working from actual letters and conversations with her, but whose words are whose and whether it's completely true isn't clear.
So Fanny's time in Harmony made a huge impact on her thinking, and here's how she describes it in a letter to a friend.
When I first visited Harmony in Descending the Waters, a vague idea crossed me that there was something in the system of United Labor as there in operation which might be rendered subservient to the emancipation of the South. After my inquiries in Louisiana and Mississippi had convinced me more than ever of the imperative necessity of some immediate remedy being applied to the evil, I revisited Harmony, then changed to New Harmony. After considering Rapp's system and practice together with those of Mr. Owen, it then occurred to me that if individual labor could not stand in competition with United Labor in a free state, how much less could it do so within the regions of slavery?
So So Fanny's talking about the power of cooperative labor to change a community, both socially and economically. Cooperation is something that's drilled into a lot of Americans of a certain age, especially who grew up on Sesame Street. But at the time, it was a concept that, kind of a precursor of what we might today refer to as socialism, that if you get a bunch of people together and if you share the means of production and share the sort of product of this labor equally, you often will end up with a more productive, more profitable, and generally sort of happier community. So basically, Fanny is saying that a persuasive model for ending slavery would need to outcompete the current plantation model economically. And she saw that cooperation could be the sort of secret sauce that would help her do that.
And in another letter, she wrote that during this tour of the U.S., my thoughts and inquiries have been engrossed by and directed almost exclusively to the subject of slavery. She's been looking at laws on enslavement and the various ideas people are throwing around for slowly reducing slavery. And she thinks she's hit on the only plan that will really work.
We have so much more to say about Fanny Wright's plan for abolishing slavery in the next episode. But first, I think we need to dig deeper into some context. How anti-slavery and pro-slavery conflicts were playing out on the American frontier around communities like Harmony. And at the time, that's what the Midwest was the frontier. So let's talk about Indiana, Illinois, and Tennessee. Because many of the narratives we've been taught are way too simplistic to really get at what's going on here. So we want to dig in deep.
We've got someone who can help us. Caroline Kissel is a professor at DePaul University. She's interested in Illinois and Ohio Valley history, especially the struggle to keep Illinois from becoming a slave state during the early years. She's been researching one of Fanny's friends and partners in Nashoba, George Flower. He immigrated from England to the U.S. to found Albion, a settlement in Illinois Territory. And he's connected to pretty much everyone. He's closely tied with both of the Harmony communities. And he even stayed on an extended visit with Thomas Jefferson. I don't know, I kind of think everybody's connected to Jefferson.
He's sort of the Kevin Bacon of early America. Yeah.
But except that everybody's 1 degree from Thomas Jefferson in this podcast.
Well, America's smaller lately.
That's right. Okay. So Flower was uniquely talented in that he was highly practical. He could actually farm and was very progressive and idealistic. And you'll also hear Caroline mention Flower's partner in developing Albion, Morris Birkbeck, but we'll try to keep the focus on George Flower.
The context behind that is that they settled in Illinois, believing because there was this federal law in effect, the Northwest Ordinance, that basically said any states that were formed out of the land northwest of the Ohio River must have constitutions that deemed them to be free states, that they would be free from slavery. So that was the law of the land. That was most likely what educated men in the 19th century who were wanting to understand the political situation, the landscape of the early United States nation they probably would have known about this law, the Northwest Ordinance. And so they knew that, states south of the Ohio, and we kind of know that because of the way that they wrote. Well, we're not, Birkbeck wrote in his travelogue, and I'm just paraphrasing it. I don't have it in me right now, but he wrote, these states south of the Ohio River, these slave states, I would never settle in them, but my search is going to be circumscribed to this scope of, the states that do not have slavery. So he looked in the East, but then he really thought he wanted to be somewhere that was less populated so that he farmed the land. And so they began to think of Indiana and Illinois. Indiana had become a state in 1816. Illinois was not yet a state, but it was a territory from 1809 to 1818. And so when they discovered the land in Illinois that and I don't say discovered in the sense that no one had ever been there, because we do know that, of course, native populations were there for quite a long time. And also the French were there for quite a long time, because this was part of French Louisiana. So they came to Illinois and felt this is a region that's not going to tolerate slavery. And boy, were they wrong. Let me just say.
And things got pretty contentious in Albion, correct? Like there was, I mean, it was almost like hand-to-hand combat at times, it sounds like, or at least some pretty intense vandalism and attacks and word slinging.
Well, yeah. And so some context around that is that, and this is, of course, a narrative that is still in effect to today, that we're, I live in Illinois, I'm an Illinoisan, and the narrative is, oh, we weren't part of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
We're part of the North. We're free from that moral stain in our history. But in actuality, the French, when Illinois was part of French Louisiana, the French practiced slave keeping, as it was called.
Mm-hmm.
There were Jesuits who settled in the area who brought African slaves in. This is the story that there was a small number of African enslaved people that were brought in to work for the Jesuits, but the practice just was part of French Louisiana, so much so that they created a document to regulate how enslaved people should behave called the Code Noir, which is the Black Code. The Code Noir was then the basis or the foundation for Illinois creating its own set of Black codes. And in fact, in 1818, when Illinois' Constitution was passed, the legislature, there were many enslavers who were in the Illinois legislature. Now, some of them were because in the Illinois Territory, that was allowed,
Mm-hmm.
and then and indentured servitude also became a practice. So even the territorial governor, Ninian Edwards, he was the only territorial governor of Illinois from 1809 to 1818. He was an enslaver by birth from Kentucky, and he brought in a number of his enslaved and registered them as indentured servants. So here was the territorial governor of Illinois who was an enslaver. And there's just these hairline distinctions between being a slave and being an indentured servant, even so hairline that I can't even really tell you fully what those differences are, because it's still a person who's bound to a contract. And it's and maybe that would be the difference. That would be the one difference with indentured servants. You have a contract, but oftentimes those contracts were signed by someone who was illiterate and maybe didn't know exactly what they were signing. So often the contracts were very, very long. They were like 99 years. I mean, like a ridiculous length of time that, in all practical purposes, you're enslaved. Because the difference would be, oh, you're indentured, you're in a contract, and that will end. But the enslaved person, of course, didn't have a contract. They were a slave for life. So fast forward a few years, here's all this history of enslavement, slavery in the Illinois Territory, in the Illinois country before that, under French Louisiana. And in 1818, then some of those practices were they were codified in the first Illinois Constitution. And the way that Illinois Constitution writers did that is they knew under that federal law, and Indiana knew this as well, and in terms of how they constructed their constitution in 1816, they knew they had to follow the federal Northwest Ordinance, which said there shall be neither slavery or servitude in this said territory. But what Illinois Constitution writers did was they added the one word hereafter, hereafter in this territory or in this state. And by adding that one word, it basically created this distinction of old slavery under the French prior to Illinois statehood. You don't have to give up your slaves. So all those people who were living there could take a sigh of relief. And, it was certain people of wealth, of means, had enslaved people. They then could remain. They didn't have to uproot their lives and their homes and leave Illinois because they were grandfathered in, so to speak.
How did that play out for in later decades, like the 1820s, which is when, George Flower and Frances Wright began discussing how to, rid the U.S. of slavery through example.
Right. So one of the things that happened under Illinois' second governor, Edward Coles, is that he was an abolitionist.
Mm-hmm.
And he was one of those rare people in the early decades of the 19th century. We're talking decades before the Civil War, where he was an enslaver by birth. He also knew Jefferson. He was also from Virginia, but he decided, I'm inheriting these slaves, but I'm going to free them because I do not morally agree with slavery. So he ended up bringing them to Illinois and setting them free. And he even gave them land. He gave each head of household land to settle in Illinois, in Madison County, Illinois. So Coles became the governor, and he advocated for abolition, and that got a lot of people riled up. And there was a sunset clause in the Illinois Constitution that was coming up, and it was due to sunset in 1825, because one of the things that was written into the 1818 Constitution is that enslaved people were allowed to work at the salt wells in Gallatin County, which salt production was a big production at the time. It was in far southern Illinois. So Kentucky enslavers were bringing in their enslaved to work in this mine, which was grueling work. It was grueling, boiling the water so that, or creating these big log fires so that they could boil off. I'm not describing it very well, but to boiling it down so you get the salt. But that logging was so intense. It was, back-breaking kind of work. So this clause was about to sunset in the Constitution in 1825. And yet here was this governor who was abolitionist. This created a lot of, upheaval. And the legislature was really against the governor. Governor Coles had won by a very narrow margin. And so what ended up happening in 1823 is that the majority pro-slavery legislators in the Illinois legislature, they called for a convention to rewrite the Constitution. So that convention had to be brought to a vote in August of 1824 before the Illinois citizens, who were, of course, the white males who could vote at the time. And what was, again, nuances, right? They weren't voting on, let's change this Constitution to permit slavery. It was, let's, revise the Constitution. But it was very veiled because everyone knew that, and what the reason we know that everyone knew this is there was this heated debate and, lots of people publishing letters in the Illinois newspapers that were going back and forth about, the allowance of slavery outright. Now, I'm not sure how they were thinking they were going to do that to get around the Northwest Ordinance.
Yeah, I guess enslavers can always dream, to put it cynically.
From February of 1823 to August of 1824, and, just side note, we're in that 200-year anniversary period right now, right? February of 1823 to August of 1824, there was this battle back and forth. Imagine if it's like present day social media and the vitriol that you can see that was playing out in the Illinois newspapers. About the issue of slavery specifically.
We forget how, as you put it, vitriolic and aggressive newspaper writing was, and letter writing was at the time. As we'll talk about within some other instances around Fanny Wright, people could be brutal.
Yeah, well, and Morris Birkbeck he did a lot of writing. He ended up writing under a pseudonym in several Illinois newspapers, posing as a poor Illinois farmer named Jonathan Freeman. And all of these letters are reprinted in George Flower's autobiography, not his memoir that's about the English settlement, which they called their community the English settlement. And that's available online. And it's the history of the English settlement in Edwards County, founded by George Flower and Morris Birkbeck in 1817. And so those letters are, he reprinted them in his memoir. And it was a back and forth between Birkbeck posing as this farmer advocating against slavery and someone who then wrote back to him named John Rifle, who, and I
Wow.
don't know that. Yeah. So what I'm fairly sure this wasn't like a plant, right? This was actually somebody writing back to him, countering him. So this was playing out in the newspapers, kind of like you would see like a post in social media and comments going on, right? Now, what is also the case, and then Birkbeck also published a 19-page pamphlet, which he circulated. So pamphlets were like a big deal in this time. And this was under his own name, and it was an appeal to the people of Illinois on the question of a convention. And that's where he was outlining some of it very much in racist terms of why we should not allow slavery into Illinois, because some of it was, if we allow the slave population into Illinois, then the Black population will grow and become out of control. So there's a lot of what we have to understand is that there was a lot of direct racism, outright racism happening, even though someone is advocating against slavery. You can be an advocate against slavery, but also not be an advocate of Black people. Now, one question that still remains is, I think, for Morris Birkbeck, is did he actually feel that way, or was he using that as a tactic?
Yeah.
And then also ask that same question of George Flower, who didn't write his thoughts down at the time, because what he was doing during this period was he was traveling around on horseback and trying to convince his neighbors to not vote for this convention. But what I do think, and this can lead up to the conversation about Nashoba, is there is more evidence that George Flower was not anti-Black. Not so sure about Morris Birkbeck, but George Flower, anti-slavery. And the reason I believe he was not anti-Black is that he was welcoming free Blacks into their community at Albion. And because he had chosen to do that, his neighbors in the surrounding area in Illinois didn't quite appreciate that. And they let him know. And then there were kidnapping attempts made on those families that lived there. And eventually the kidnapping became so intense that Flower sat down with the families and said, do you want to remain here? Or here's this opportunity if you'd like to relocate to Haiti. Now, that we could go on and on about the value of, like, what was he thinking? Why couldn't they settle somewhere else? Was he actually really thinking about their human rights? But the fact is, he did help a group of some of those free Blacks that had settled at Albion to travel to Haiti and settle there with the help of the Haitian government. And this was the new Haitian government, right? After the revolution in 1823. So this would have been before Nashoba was established. So he had all of this, experience and knowledge as well. He didn't travel himself to Haiti, but he arranged for this passage. And so that then impacted the ultimate fate of the enslaved who were at Nashoba as well, because he did assist Frances Wright in in helping her to get that set up.
Yeah.
But I believe she did travel there with them.
She did. And I think but I'm sure that George's experience was pretty instrumental in helping her make that decision. And I think for a lot of white abolitionists, colonization felt like the best option.
Right.
Not that, without probably consulting in any depth the people they're talking to, though the options were kind of thin on the ground. I mean, that's why so many folks walked to Canada, I mean, it was a rough time to be a free African American.
We could say, did they consult the people that they were helping to move? On the one hand, some may have wanted to have that fresh start.
Yeah.
We could say that, because What's challenging is how do we take our 21st century thinking and step back into that 19th century thinking? Now, if we were to fast forward to someone like Frederick Douglass, I mean, he was, definitely adamant about, helping to change Lincoln's mind about emancipation. And I know this is far afield from the Frances Wright.
But it's really important to understand where people were in the 1820s and what the options actually were and what the system was. Because part of the difficulty that both Flower and Wright faced was, how do we escape the system, or how do we dismantle the system from within? And whether, and that was maybe a paternalistic approach that they took, but at the same time, it might have been one of the few approaches available. But, that's...
And Lincoln was a quote unquote colonizationist for a while. He believed gradual emancipation, slavery's going to die out an eventual natural death. That's what people thought. That's what Jefferson thought, versus immediate emancipation. We really need to end this institution now, which is like, the newspaper editor, William Lloyd Garrison, who ran his abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, for 35 years. And in the beginning, he was a gradualist, and he became an advocate for immediate emancipation.
Oh, those shifts in thinking about the goals and the philosophical underpinnings of abolitionist action are one of the reasons Fanny's story, I think, is so interesting. It's this time kind of in between the great ideals of the American Revolution and actually making a movement happen.
What Caroline pointed out about how people could be both anti-slavery and anti-Black is super important. The motivations of white abolitionists at the time were very diverse, and just being against slavery does not make someone a hero or a role model. Yeah, what Caroline pointed out about how people could be both anti-slavery and anti-Black is super important. The motivations of white abolitionists at this time were very diverse, and just being against slavery does not make someone a hero or a role model. They could still be a pretty blatant white supremacist.
Yeah.
So this kind of points to a bigger point that I think both you and I agree, Eleanor, that we want to make with this podcast, is there are no perfect people in the present, and definitely not in the past, any more than you might find a perfect hero walking down your street today. Another really important point in George Flower's story is, it took a village. It took someone who actually had some practical experience creating a new town in the middle of nowhere, which George had. Nashoba could never have happened without his expertise and his practical urge to turn ideas into reality. He must have been a pretty go-getting, fun kind of guy. I don't know. It would have been really, really fun to have dinner with George.
Oh, absolutely. So how did Fanny Wright's faith in cooperation play out against this backdrop? How did things go at Nashoba? Well, here's what she wrote just a few years later.
Land and labor, we then said, were wealth. In principle, we were right, but with a view to actual practice in the existing generation, we were wrong. My dear Jennings, cooperation has well nigh killed us all. We have all had our share of sufferings and exertions. I have had mine, dear Jennings, but they have left me only firmer in purpose, more inflexible in principle, while they have enriched me with experience. If dearly, not too dearly purchased, seeing that is invaluable. Farewell affectionately, Frances Wright.
Oh man, that's rough.
Well, coming up in episode 4, what was Fanny Wright's plan for Nashoba? How did it fit in with bigger conversations and movements of the time? What made it revolutionary? And what made it problematic? And how was it a product of its moment?
Spoiler alert, white feminism. So we'll look at how the plan actually played out on the ground in Tennessee, the personality conflicts, the scandals, the stark economic realities, the malaria. But mostly we really want to situate Nashoba in the broader context of all the discussions that were going on at the time. So it can seem like a wild and crazy experiment, but it's very much something that sprang from a lot of things that Americans were talking about all over the frontier and on the East Coast as well.
But you know what? We'll get to that next time.
Yeah. Hold your hats. We'll talk to you soon.
Fanny Wright was voiced by Emily McGee.
Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical is a co-production of New Year Media and Her Reputation for Accomplishment. Written and hosted by Eleanor Rust and Tristra Yeager.
Made possible by a grant from the Working Men's Institute, New Harmony, Indiana, and by the generosity of the Ephraimson Family Fund. Thanks also to the Bloomington Area Arts Council for supporting this podcast.
Music by Eleanor Dubinsky. Editing and audio support by Josh Perez. See you next time.